This is the Open University.
Hello, my people, my very own tribe of Momites out there. It sounds like some sort of awful savoury spread, doesn't it? Momite. I don't really have a theme today, but I've been working a lot on strange little side projects. Like I did a kind of re-edit of Tom York dancing stupidly in a Radiohead video, Lotus Flower video. Stuck it to a Viv Stanshall track.
Spruced up in me piccolo, me tit for me daisies, bowling down the rubber with me cherry china Fido, a royal oily rag, me cherry bread and cheese. You won't ever wanna see some geezer.
To continue a sort of debate that was happening on the Guardian website about dad dancing, something called dad dancing, people doing embarrassing dancing. The Guardian didn't really seem to grasp the idea that embarrassment is good. This is a particular theme of mine. I think that rock music usually, all too often, has connoted, I mean, I think of it as a dead form now, like classical music, a repertoire form. But it has connoted a kind of competence and the swagger, the machismo of competence, rather than any kind of interesting ambivalence, awkwardness, or vulnerability. So very few artists, David Bowie notably, have made videos in which they made themselves look not just vulnerable, but also awkward. I mean, some of the dance routines in, say, the Never Let Me... Time Will Crawl, the Time Will Crawl video, for instance, where Bowie's being flung about and sort of beaten up by... I suppose, it takes its cue from Michael Jackson's Beat It or something, but, to be beaten up in a choreographed way, or it goes back to West Side Story, it's more like the kind of thing you would see in a stage show, a theatrical piece, than in a rock video, which was simply out to prove the credentials of some boring, awful band like Status Quo or Oasis, just sort of weak and swagger, or even Slade or someone like that. And Bowie particularly, I'm particularly fond of the fashion video where he's actually testing the meme potential of a series of gestures, like rat gestures, which he then wipes his nose. I've talked about this before. He sort of embarrassedly tries to disown. He does all this with just physical theatre, which is the amazing thing. It's a song, and he can't talk over his song, but he can show you how he's in a dance studio in a highly viral environment like Soho, Manhattan, and he's trying to be the originator of new trends and memes, but he's not succeeding, and therefore he's being like an unsuccessful cult leader, essentially trying to spin things which are just not washing with his Momites, his Bowieites. And it's true that even I was a very huge fan of his, of course, through most of my life, but I certainly wouldn't follow everything he would do, and I wouldn't even buy every album he put out, at least not initially. I was a very critical, scrutinizing sort of person. So anyway, I've been doing that kind of thing, and I made an edit of a Danny Absey poem, which I just heard on BBC Radio 4 Extra the other day.
Away then with trees and roses. They are inhuman. Away also with rivers, the disgusting Ganges bleeding from Brahma's big toe, the Rubicon cause of the Civil War, the Acheron river of sorrows, Tiber that drowned Horatius the One-Eyed.
I'd never heard any Danny Absey poems before. Apparently a Jewish Welshman. Post-war, I think he released his first collection of poems in 1949. I'm very poetry-oriented right now. I've been reading E.E. Cummings and Marianne Moore and Danny Absey.
You can't trust a star, that's sure. So when the green flies in the rose and the dragonfly drops its shadow in the river, when the axe hides in the tree with its listening shriek, and clouds gag the starlight with grey handkerchiefs, I contend, sir, that we should pity them no more, but concern ourselves with more natural things.
I particularly like that poem because it's sort of a satirical. That's just an excerpt from it. That's not the whole thing, but it's a kind of satirical jab at nature poetry, I suppose. Really, saying why the hell should we be grateful? Why should we put nature on a pedestal when nature doesn't put us on a pedestal? But couched in this format of a letter to the Times. I like satire, obviously, and I like poems, or I like any kind of art which kind of imitates another form. Ekphrasis, I guess you would call it, if it was, say, a poem talking about a painting, like My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, although that's really around a painting, but it describes a painting of a woman who turns out to be possibly the murdered wife of this aristocrat. Actually, that was a hugely important poem for my development of my unreliable narrator as Momus, My Last Duchess, because he's an unreliable narrator, and you're initially drawn in. You're on a little guided tour with him. I guess he is the unreliable tour guide, the original unreliable tour guide, because he's taking you around his own private picture gallery and saying, yes, this was my last Duchess, and then you begin to realize with a creeping horror that he's done away with her, and he's making confession of this to you, and then you step away. Certainly, if not physically, you step away from believing, from your credibility, your credulity.
Free from anxiety to be forever pleasing, she could entertain herself with hopes. So time went on. The house was not so happy as before. Something was fading and vanishing that would not return.
So what else is happening? The rainy season has hit Japan. We've had pretty much solid rain for the last 48 hours, actually. I think today it's dried up a bit. I quite welcome the coolness, the freshness, and I love the sounds of the rain on a quiet street like this one, a leafy street. It patters on the trees and against the window, and I can hear it on the roof of the building too. There have been little tremors from time to time. It's funny when you're in the middle of a typhoon and there's also an earth tremor, but Tokyo just rocks in a fairly gentle way every couple of days. It's not such an unusual thing up here as it is in Osaka. In Osaka, I lived there for 6-7 years and didn't feel any earthquakes, really. Apart from there was one in Kyushu that we could feel in Osaka, but really nothing. So I've just got 2 weeks now left here in Japan. My last visit of this year, anyway. I hope to be back in this very house actually next year as well, and on a fairly regular basis. So I can claim to live between Tokyo and Berlin now, because my Berlin lease begins on July the 1st, as I've told you many times. And I'm sad to be leaving, and also I'm a little restless and bored. I mean, recently I've been making albums during the rainy season. It's actually a great time to stay indoors when you're in Japan. So my Pillycock album, for instance, last year was made exactly this time of year, exactly 1 year ago. Well, June into July, into August of 2017. And I really love that album. I love the way that turned out. It has a certain tropical exoticism or something that might result from the climate and the weather, it might not. And so I'm curious to know what will emerge if I start recording a record in Berlin, my 2018 album. I have really no ideas about what it should or could be. I might make a brief visit to Paris before I go to Berlin. I've got a few days at the end of the month in which I don't yet have a place in Berlin, so I'm listening to a lot of Georges Brassens just now, and sort of quite traditional French storytelling, songwriting, and music hall is kind of music hall characters continue to be really important for me. So I love the idea of making kind of comedy routines, cabaret routines with characters, character-driven, comedy-driven even. I don't know, but these things always change. Intention, that was the theme last week. This week there is no theme, but I went off to a dinner party at the weekend with an ex-girlfriend, not with an ex-girlfriend, to the house of a married woman who was once somebody I lived with in Tokyo. I lived in Tokyo. After 9/11 I left New York, and I spent 2001, 2002, half the time in New York, half the time in Tokyo, and then basically moved to Tokyo in 2002 and lived in Meguro, by the river, by the tennis courts and the Meguro Museum. So yeah, it was her, Shizu. She's married. She married someone I introduced her to actually in 2002, David Dehili, who's and they live by. They live in Shibuya now, and they live by showing art collectors around Tokyo. So if you're a wealthy art collector and you want to be introduced to people in the Japanese art world, they're the ones. I'll put you in touch with them. You've got to be a Guggenheim though. No, not really. But yeah, we were there with a guy called Paul Baron, who's a French entrepreneur, and has moved back to Paris now. He used to be based here in Tokyo, and he started Tokyo Art Beat, which is still the best resource for finding out what art exhibitions are on in Tokyo. And but the Me Too came up, so we were arguing well after midnight about Me Too, and I don't know, it's probably terribly controversial for me to even map out any kind of stance on it. I kind of feel that no good can come of that conversation, except for there being the evildoers unmasked, which is in itself a pretty good, the Weinsteins unmasked. But my worries about it are that in an overarching sense it marks the end of private life, the end of privacy, and is that really such a great development that now everything we might do might be held up at some point in the court of public opinion, not a court, but the court of public opinion. Hence, someone like Woody Allen can win in court and be have all charges against him dismissed, yet in the court of public opinion can be seen as guilty because somebody makes an emotive appeal on YouTube or whatever it is. So there is this whole array of new tools which are emotive but not quite as rational as the old tools may have been. Maybe the court system wasn't the best system, but it was something, and it was a measured and careful way to judge whether someone should lose his or her reputation. It's also very much a way to just run celebrity stories past people, but in a much darker way than they used ever to be run past people. And I think I rather worry about the fact that it's all figures. Figures are being downed who can be gossiped about because they're arts celebrities mostly. It's mostly people in the arts who, it's Lars von Trier and people like that, Woody Allen, film directors. Obviously, the very phrase casting couch did imply what everybody knew, which was that there was a certain way to get to land roles if you were a pretty girl in Hollywood or wherever, and the ambitious ones were going to try that just like they were going to try everything else. So I think a lot of it is just kind of an extrapolated, belated horror at the very implications of that word casting couch, that there was such a thing, and there will continue to be such things because sex is a power. And this is my other objection, and my other worry is that feminism, the thrust of feminism has been about empowering women, or it should ideally have been deconstructing patriarchy and empowering women. This doesn't mean mansplaining feminism, you see, but in fact it's this latest development seems to disempower women because it strips them of agency, because it carries with it a very strong implication that there can only be meaningful consent given in a sexual situation where there is total equality between the parties involved. And I think that works against the dynamics of sexuality, which you're often turned on by differences in culture, differences in gender obviously, and differences in status. Those can be a huge turn on, differences in age, whatever. I don't see how there can be any meaningful consent given, because there isn't really true equality in this world. And therefore, if you strip people of the right, even of the possibility of giving consent, or say it's just provisional consent and you might change your mind later, when you see that you were exploited in retrospect, whatever, that seems to take away the whole idea of agency from a woman or from anyone who feels in a sexual encounter encounter feels there's some inequality, because there is always going to be. We don't live in a perfect world. Everybody's not equal. There's always... Sex is a weird, irrational force, that doesn't just sit neatly with human rights and all the rest of it, although it has to work within legal frameworks, obviously. So that's why I think we should go back to courts and not really trust the court of popular opinion. God knows if I trusted the court of popular opinion after my musical career, I would be a very depressed person. I think people's judgment is often wrong. They chose Oasis over me. Fine, Great Britain. Choose the bloody Gallagher brothers over me, over Mamas. That is the court of popular opinion. That's what you end up with. You end up with something pretty bland and brutal. And so I worry about that. I think, those are my worries, really. Privacy, agency, and what was the third one? Anyway, I can't be too neat about it. And we were getting increasingly drunk on Saturday night and discussing this. And I think me and Paul basically were on the same page, mostly. We were all kind of on the same page. We were talking about Araki, the photographer. Why the differences between Japan and America? Why has Terry Richardson fallen, but Araki not? It's partly because of sympathy for Araki's loss of his wife through cancer, the fact he seems like a nice guy, although he can be a bit of a bully, apparently, in certain situations. And of course, he's always been hiding in plain daylight. He admits freely that he has sex with his models, and as did Terry Richardson. He famously said, why do you think I have a hole in my jeans? Anyway, evildoers are being toppled, but I think there's a certain Pandora's box thing where, I think once you open that, or the beast box, as Howard Devoto used to call it, it could really... Nobody is safe, and I wish the awful people would all be toppled. Obviously, Rupert Murdoch or someone like that, topple him. Don't topple film directors like Lars von Trier, though, because the world is already fairly bereft of original spirits and great talents. And I think it's really sad if we would just go after artists because they're, easy. Low-hanging fruit, in a sense. Morally, they're obviously low-hanging fruit. And even my great hero, David Bowie, has been accused. I mean, I've stopped reading Salon.com because they jumped in like the day after he died with some awful character assassination about him. Anyway, Controversy. That should knock up my views. Maybe I'll actually get 800 this week.
Open University.
Voluble and odd. A house that to my last hour on earth will seem home to me, stood on the verge of a wide heath. Gloomy with ennui. Do you suppose I'm still in my teens? It's little you ever really feel. I don't think I'm quite without feeling. You are a little difficult, you know. Age. It turns one to stone. Life's a dream. Ask Nicholas here. But one wakes on a devilish hard pallet. You ask me to be fearless, sincere, to speak my heart. I wonder, do you? I am past sincerity now. And as for heart, it is a quite discredited organ. Existence proves nothing but brazen inanity afterwards. But there's always that turning left to the dullest and dustiest road. Oblivion. We must do our best.